Welcome, and thank you for joining this third and final roundtable of our series, which is about building resilient systems. I'm really pleased to be co-chairing this series with Sir Chris Ham. Chris needs little introduction, but he is currently in the independent chair of Coventry and Warwickshire STP, a non-executive director of the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust, and a board advisor at CF. He has also recently been appointed as co-chair of the new NHS Assembly. I imagine many of you are well versed in Zoom by now, but for those of you listening live, we ask you to keep your camera off and the mute button on, and we recommend that you activate the speaker view setting, which will focus on whichever panelist is speaking as opposed to gallery view. You can access and change this setting by clicking on the icon on the top right of your video panel. Whether you're participating live or watching the recording, I hope you have a cup of tea handy and that you can take the next hour to sit back and enjoy the conversation. It is an opportunity to reflect, to think. I hope it provides some reassurances in the approaches you are taking, but also some new ideas as well. The plan is I will provide a very short overview of why we're doing this roundtable series, and then Chris is going to get us started on today's conversation by introducing our fabulous panelists, starting us off with some questions. We will open it up to Q&A for those of you listening in live. If you have a question, please don't hesitate to add it to the chat. That way the panelists and Chris and I can see it. So why this roundtable? Well, it's no secret that COVID has brought about massive challenges in health and care. It's caused a level of disruption unlike anything most of us have experienced before. Especially during times of crisis and uncertainty, we as leaders must remain focused on our mission and adaptive to our environment. We've spoken to about 40 leaders in recent weeks about their reflections, challenges, and priorities in light of these last few months. And what we've seen is leaders are permanently shifting on how to plan, prioritize, and deliver services. We are truly in strange and unusual times, and we want to use this platform as an opportunity to bring people together, share ideas, and offer some healthy challenge, and perhaps a few aha moments. Our goal is to offer relevant, timely insights through a robust forum for discussion, and as we aim to tackle specific issues that are at the forefront of the agenda for leaders and organisations. So that's enough from me. I'm going to pass to Chris to get us started on today's conversation.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah. Very pleased to be working with you and colleagues on the panel today. I'm going to be very brief with my introductions. I have lengthy bio CVs for each panelist, but we really want to get into the discussion quickly. So let me just run through who's with us today and then ask Sam Higginson the first question. First of all, Steve Russell. Steve is Chief Executive of the Harrogate and District NHS Foundation Trust. Francis O'Callaghan is the Accountable Officer for North Central London CCG. Sam Higginson, Chief Executive of Norfolk and Norwich University Hospitals Foundation Trust. And then last but not least, my former colleague Richard Murray, Chief Executive of the King's Fund, each bringing a wide range of experiences in different roles relevant to our discussion today. So let's get going. If I could turn to Sam first of all, and given our focus, as Hannah said, is on resilient systems. Sam, could you just reflect for a moment on what's worked well in Norfolk and Waveney system in response to COVID-19, and what have you really struggled with?
Thanks, Chris. I just want to start by paying testament to all of the fantastic staff in the NHS, but also, of course, in my hospital in the Norfolk and Waveney system, because for me, one of the reflections of particularly that first few months was the flexibility and a real sense of the NHS rising to the challenge. So if you think about things like in the NHS long-term plan, where we said we would deliver a shift to virtual outpatients over 3 to 5 years, we delivered it in 3 to 5 weeks. So there are some real senses of things we did differently. Similarly, we were able to train about over 1,500 staff in critical care skills. very quickly within a few days. And I've got lots of examples of things like ophthalmology surgeons going and actually looking after medical patients on the medical wards. So there's that whole sense of flexibility and in it together. There was also a real move from individual organisations to working as system by default. So again, we've got examples in Norfolk and Waveney of sharing teams. So for example, our infection and prevention control team and aligning policies so that we did things together. I guess the challenges looking forward are one of the things the last few months has really exposed to us is our underinvestment in digital infrastructure. We've now got staff working from home. We're trying to do things virtually. We never had infrastructure in place to deliver care in that different way. And that's a big challenge for us. We're also having to think a lot more about how do we put in place some structures to maintain that system working. So we've developed a committees in common type structure for the 3 acute trusts in the patch as a way to try and put some governance around how we work. And now we're also beginning to have to start thinking about grappling with the ever-growing waiting list issues and how could we move towards creating a single PTL for the system. What does that look like technically, but also then all the challenges of moving a patient from one end of the patch to the other end of the patch, and how might we be able to deliver care in a different way. So lots of positives, but now lots of challenges, particularly as we head into the winter.
Great, thank you. Let me move on to Francis. You arrived at NCL just as the pandemic was impacting on the NHS. You've been there, what, 6-7 months now, Francis. Yes. How real is the system in North Central London?
So I think sort of building on what Sam has said, it's very clear that we couldn't have responded to the COVID crisis unless we worked as a system. If we tried to do it as individual organisations, we would have failed, because very early on it became clear that the mutuality between us was the most important thing, be that the supply of PPE or workforce, but also the very practical and necessary conversations with the local authority and the voluntary sector around discharge. So I think it's really clear that the crisis brought us together, and building on sort of how we continue, I think it's really important to acknowledge the evaluative work we need to do and the ongoing conversation with our local residents, because it's been a massive change for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. And if I turn now to Steve Russell up in Harrogate. Steve, we hear a lot about place as well as systems. You're in a pretty definable place, aren't you, in North Yorkshire?
We are, and I suppose there's a sort of reflection of some of the things that perhaps we didn't get right through the pandemic. So West Yorkshire and Harrogate's got a really well-established provider collaborative in Wyatt. And we were really, really fortunate to be able to lever the relationships that exist in the way that we responded to the pandemic. Your point about place, though, is I think something we've reflected on, in the sense that we slightly, it may be different in different parts of the country, but we slightly defaulted to our sectors. So we emphasised system working across sectors quite a lot. And I think that quite a lot of colleagues would reflect that despite lots of effort before the pandemic to try and join services up, and Harrogate is an ideal place to do that because of its geography, and the steps that were made with relationships in primary care, community services and secondary care actually got a bit fractured through the pandemic, partly because of some of the actions that we took that seemed sensible at the time, but also much of our focus became horizontal rather than vertical. And I think building that back will be quite hard work, and something that it was hard enough at the first go in some ways. It's going to be even harder now, and people are continuing to operate horizontally in many respects. So I guess something for us to think about that we might not have got quite right.
Yeah, great. And then Richard, if I come to you, you see the bigger picture. Do you think the NHS is better prepared now, as we're seeing a resurgence of COVID, than was the case back in February?
I think it's certainly in a better place, both in terms of the core clinical understanding of the disease and how it operates, and the importance of maintaining infection control within hospitals and supporting colleagues out in primary care and in social care too. So a lot of learning from the first round. There are some challenges with that. Clearly some staff are suffering from exhaustion. They're now facing the second wave of COVID coming in, and they've already been through one, and not quite clear where on the horizon that would end. And we have to remember that the context has changed from where we were in April. I think one of the things that helped resilience in some areas was the strength of the voluntary sector's engagement with the NHS. Now, as Steve said, that definitely didn't happen everywhere, but in some places it did. And one of the things that helped get patients out of hospital and help them stay at home was that very close working we saw in some places with the BCSE and with social care providers. We have to remember that quite a few of those organisations are in the midst of redundancy rounds. Their finances have been very badly damaged. They're not quite as strong as they were when we went into it. And I think that understanding of where that wider system is, I think as Steve has said, about not only the NHS, but where is social care, where is the voluntary sector? And indeed, as we saw today from the Carers Association, quite what's the situation with carers themselves who had to put in enormous amounts of additional effort. So we have to try and remember that system-based approach. It's not just the NHS.
Yeah, well, that's very important. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those themes, voluntary sector and the role of local authorities too, which I see in much of my work increasingly salient as a key partner of the NHS. But let me hand over now to Hannah.
Thanks, Chris. Steve, I want to pick up with you, and I guess less from your reflections on the lessons that you've got to learn, but more on the success of the provider collaborative work that you've been doing, and perhaps you can offer some lessons from that work for others. So I guess one of the things that is remarkable about the impact of the pandemic is just the unleashing of clinical leadership that has happened across the system. And I feel really strong desire from colleagues that people want to harness that and hold on to it. So can you talk a bit about the role that's played in the provider collaborative that you're part of? And, you know, what's your thinking about how you make sure you secure that into the future?
Nice, easy question. Thank you. I guess if you look back, one of the things that we lent on very heavily in probably every part of the country was critical care networks. They've existed forever, but I would hazard a guess that we all think about them very differently now than we did before. So before, they were often about QI or peer review, describing standards, but perhaps felt like they sat off to one side. Through the pandemic, as you say, the level of clinical engagement, leadership, support, advice, guidance that was unleashed, but interestingly unleashed collectively across organisations as opposed to within organisations, is something that I think we'd probably all like to try and capitalise on. The bit I think was different, perhaps, was the networks that perhaps had felt a little bit off to one side in some respects had a single goal, a very clear focus, and they were working collectively on a problem that mattered to all of the organisations, and it mattered to all of the organisations at the same time. And I think that really helped turn what was something that felt off to the side into something that we relied on and could not have got through the pandemic without. And I suppose thinking about going forward and what the lessons might be for us in that context, I can take absolutely no credit for this whatsoever, but West Yorkshire Association of Acute Trusts is a really strong provider collaborative. It's got really good relationships across all of the executive directors and others that make up the system. And one of the things that has been helpful is hardwiring some of those networks into the provider collaborative. So Mel Pickup is the chief exec at Bradford. She is the sponsor chief exec for the Crit Care and Major Trauma Network, and it therefore has a bit more of a connection into some of our day-to-day work. And I think that connection, working on a real problem, is something that we really need to try and build into the future way of using networks.
Thanks, Steve. Sam, what about your kind of lessons and learning from provider collaboration in the horizontal domain, as Steve was referring to it?
So we're further behind than Steve and colleagues in West Yorkshire, but what we have now set up is the Norfolk and Waveney Hospitals Group. And as I talked about earlier, that's underpinned by our committees in common structure. And I guess initially we've really used that in three ways. One is to try and address some of the workforce gaps we've got across the system. So for example, we now have a Norfolk and Waveney urology and a Norfolk and Waveney ENT service, where we're using bigger networks to attract people to come and join us. Secondly, was this point about sharing teams across the different providers where we think we can get better results from scale. And then thirdly, the bit we're trying to think a bit about is we've embarked on a joint electronic patient record project across the three, because our view is increasingly we need to recognise we need more consistent systems and processes across the whole patch, when before that was always done on a trust by trust basis.
Thanks, Sam. Richard, let be keen to bring you into this conversation. I'm sure you've got a perspective from having worked right across the country with different colleagues. I want to pick up the point I was asking about clinical leadership and how the pandemic really unleashed clinical leadership. And I guess Steve was reflecting, maybe it's easier when you've got a kind of more focused priority that colleagues are aligning behind. But what do you think needs to happen in order to hold on to that clinical leadership that's happened?
I think two things, and the first is just kind of a heads up. We do get that common narrative about the importance and the success of clinical leadership in the response to COVID, but it does tend to be an NHS trust and foundation trust agenda. So if you speak to quite a few GPs, this isn't necessarily what it felt like. It's not what it felt like for them. I mean, some, depending on where you're in the country, I think felt to some extent slightly abandoned to face COVID on their own. I'm sure that they weren't, but that's what it felt like. And so there's a real need there to try and make sure that some of that clinical leadership is just as powerful in primary care and community settings as it is within the trust sector, within the acute sector, and indeed in mental health as well. And I think at the moment, many parts of the country are thinking through both about new structures at ICS level, whether or not that's the ICS itself or provider collaboratives, but also about how they build on and make stronger the relationships that were going on at place, which is both where there's some element of horizontal cross-working, but that's where a lot of the vertical working between different parts of the system come. And I think as we do that, it's to build in that clinical leadership from the outset. There can be a bit of a tendency from NHS reorganisations in the past to become slightly non-clinical in their focus, to really think about issues of accountability, governance, which are all incredibly important, but slightly lose the sight over the importance of clinical leadership and clinical engagement. So I think it's for all of us as we engage in thinking through response to COVID wave 2, but also what we want to be and where we want to be as we come out of it, to try and build in the space and the time for that clinical engagement and leadership from the outset.
Thanks, Richard. And I think that's a strong challenge, although one that potentially colleagues in North Central London have been rising to in respect to clinical leadership across primary care. Francis, it'd be great to offer some reflections on this point from your perspective.
I think one of the most powerful things that happened during COVID was when we were sitting in a system, what we called system gold meeting, which went from every day, now currently only runs once a week, but it's the most intensive hour of the week, where we had a conversation about patients who weren't coming to hospital, and patients didn't want to come to hospital. Would we take them off the waiting list? And the sharp recognition that just because they didn't want to come to hospital, they were still patients and somebody would need to look after them. And the dawning of the sort of acute CEOs that, oh, well, that'll be primary care then. And the recognition that we're creating a whole different way of looking after patients. And just because you don't want to come to hospital, there are things that need to happen whilst you wait on a list for whatever reason. And obviously, in recognition of understanding that lots of patients didn't present for non-COVID presentations, they are being looked after by the GPs, by the community services. And I think that sort of mutuality that we have built, and we have very strong primary care leadership in NCL, but building that sort of mutual respect and the recognition was a really powerful moment for us. There are many examples, but that was really the epiphany amongst the trust CEOs.
Thanks, Francis. It sounds like a powerful moment, which hopefully colleagues can hold on for some time. So if you're listening live, don't let Chris and I hog all of the questions. Tell us what you would like to answer, what you would like answered by putting it in the chat. But for now, I'm going to let Chris have another go.
Well, thanks. I'd like to carry on the conversation with Francis, if I may, because one of my reflections on what we've been saying so far, it's all about the providers. You know, it's all about provider collaboratives and horizontal integration and clinical engagement and making sure the GPs are recognised and valued. So, Francis, do we need commissioners?
Well, I think one of the things that we do know about COVID is that it's shone a very stark light on inequalities. And I think unless you have somebody at system level continually thinking about how to commission for inequalities, things won't change. I think there is a very broad commitment within our ICS to better understand inequalities, but we will change inequalities only by shifting some of our resource around. And I don't just mean within the NHS, I mean within the local authority, within the voluntary sector, and understanding that the only way to prevent people getting sick is to do that very early work with them. And obviously early years is a huge part of what we need to think about. We talk a lot about commissioning for population health, and I think we understand that we need to see our populations over bigger footprints than the CCGs were previously able to. But when we really talk about commissioning for population health, we have to have a granular understanding at borough and neighbourhood and even at ward level in terms of what those differences and problems are. So I think we do need commissioning to be sophisticated at that population health level, but we need to be braver, and we need to understand where we're going to spend our money. So as you know, in NCL we have some fabulous international institutions and they offer amazing care, but actually we would prefer it if our patients didn't need to go to hospital. And that will only happen by understanding the pathway at the very beginning. I think we also understand, and the local authorities are much better at this than we are, we're getting to understand, well, what do you mean by an anchor institution? If we're going to buy care, we need to buy care from healthy organisations that are embedded in their communities if we are going to get value for money for the NCL residents. So what does it mean to be an anchor institution? It means about the commitment to the local economy. It means about employing local staff, but it also means about that there's progress on things like the res data, you know, that there is a diversity in the institution. So there is definitely a role for commissioning, but again, it has to be done in a collaborative way, because we can't just strip money out. We've got to be very, very mindful of how we move forward. And finally, we've got to work out our longer term relationship with the local authorities. If they are in trouble, we are in trouble. If we cannot discharge our patients because they cannot pay for them, then that will slow the whole system down. So how do we build that mutuality when we know that their financial position is very, very precarious?
Yeah, thank you. Richard, can I bring you in on this? Because I know you and King's Fund colleagues are doing work with a number of systems as well as people at a national level. Are we on the cusp of it being all about systems and much less about organisations?
I'd pause a bit and say, if you say systems, the temptation is then for everyone to think you mean the ICS. And if that is the conversation that we're all about to go into, then I'd be a bit worried about that. You don't integrate with social care providers at an ICS footprint on the whole. They're too big. There's relationship to local authorities, yes, but many ICSs actually are quite distant to many local authorities. They span multiple boundaries. So if the systems within systems, if that includes the place-based agenda, then I think we're on the cusp of an opportunity. There's an understanding about the role of ICS. I think there's a understanding about the role and the potential of working across a system in a horizontal and vertical at place too. But we've got to remember that there are challenges. So sometimes, as I do sit in these conversations, not today, but they can become very much about NHS institutions. So we talk about integration. What we mean is integration between NHS acute trusts. And if you look at provider collaboratives, to the extent that they exist, they've got a very strong acute tinge about them. And if you then bake those in at ICS level, you have a natural, rather an unnatural preponderance of the acute sector. So I think the opportunities are there. I think we just need to be very mindful as we do it. And so if we're talking about integration and we're talking about population health, look around the digital room and see who's there. There's no one from a local authority. There's no one from the voluntary sector. There's no one from social care. What you're talking about then is integration amongst NHS organisations. That's what it's become. So I think that opportunity is there. And by the way, I should say that integration is a great thing. It's hugely helpful. So I don't want to lose that too. But they are on two different levels. One between NHS organisations that can and might not include primary care, and then into the wider community and the wider system. If you really want to do population health, you have to go all the way to the right. And I think the history of the NHS tells us that can be a challenge.
So Steve, I mean, it sounds like we're more on the cusp of a move from organisations to populations.
Yeah, so I think Francis's point's really instructive, isn't it? So we talk a lot about inequalities that we've learned about because of the pandemic, and that's magically flipped us all into thinking about population health. There's a bunch of people who, some of whom might be on the call and some of whom won't be, who are thinking, did you not know? Because that's been what we've lived our lives thinking about for the last however many years. And their primary care physicians, their public health specialists, their local government colleagues. So the sort of the renewed focus on inequalities and population health is really welcomed. But a load of people have been thinking about this before. And I think Richard's just word of caution there is a really important one. So I think commissioning probably does need to change, but we mustn't confuse the approach and the processes with the expertise and the mindset. So within commissioning, both in local government and in health, we've had colleagues in commissioning functions who understand population health, who have been thinking about inequalities, who have been trying to drive integration across pathways. And if we get to a place where we've got strategic commissioning and integrated providers, the integrated providers have to look different from a mindset and an expertise perspective, because we have to be able to discharge some of those functions and responsibilities. And at the moment, I'm sure other people are probably more well set up, but the vast majority of place-based integrated providers won't have all of that expertise at their disposal.
No, that's a good point. And Sam, you're leading a large acute trust in Norfolk. What does population health mean practically to you?
So I think the conversation and the points that Steve and Richard just made are really important, because there is a real danger that the provider collaborative conversation very quickly rushes off and becomes an acute-based horizontal conversation. And if we look at some of the successes of phase one of COVID, it was actually all about how does the local community work together? How did everyone work? How did the local authorities respond in terms of us being able to discharge and look after patients in the community? And how did we support colleagues in primary care? So I'm worried that we need a both in the provider collaborative conversation, which is we need that vertical bit as well as that horizontal bit, because the longer term agenda has to be that place agenda. And I guess the challenge is, how do we make the place format load bearing? Because I think the issue is we always default to going in a different direction because we haven't built up enough momentum and infrastructure around the place conversation to really then take it on. And partly that's about the time it takes to deliver changes in population health. But also I think we do need to challenge ourselves about how do we focus on a small number of things to really now move that agenda along.
Yeah, thanks. Francis, if I can come back briefly to you before we hand back to Hannah. So the phase 3 plans are system plans, and the regions are going to hold systems to account on money, on performance, on cancer waits, long waits, endoscopy, all the other important things we're trying to focus on. How well equipped is either your system, or if you prefer, systems in general, to take on that load-bearing work?
I think that you're getting to the nub of a really important question, because is the ICS sort of a hierarchical, at present non-statutory body that oversees everything and is accountable for everything? Or is it, as we try to describe it, it's a way of working that allows system leadership to flourish? So I don't know the answer yet. And I think in the absence of legislation, we've got to be as flexible as we can in our thinking. But I also know that the ICS leadership is not myself, my colleague Rob and Joe Savage sitting in an office. It's that gold team of people that are bringing about change. So for example, in terms of understanding who's responsible for bringing the waiting list down, it can't just be the single institution because they can't do it on their own. So how do we create a way of working that allows them to let go and manage our patients as a system and a shared PTL? I think we have to be held to account for that, which is much harder than holding us to account for numbers of people on a waiting list. So it's a really critical question.
Yeah, thanks. So great answers, and discussion to be continued. Hannah, can I pass back to you?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the question that's in the chat. I promise that Chris and I are going to come back to it in a moment, but before we do, I really want to ask, starting with Richard, a question about leadership, style and approach, because what we're describing to be successful in this context is complicated. You know, the leadership ask is complex. And I know, Richard, your work at the King's Fund, you talk a lot about the importance and power of relationships. And frankly, they're fundamental. And where I guess I've seen the most resilient systems through this period, it's where those relationships across the broader public sector into communities with voluntary sector organizations were powerful to start with. But the reality is, Francis, Steve, Sam, they're getting pulled in multiple directions all the time. So I'm interested to hear what you think the leadership ask is for people in their shoes right now.
I think we're on a journey, and I'll use slightly unfair terms, but if in the past it was all about running your organization successfully, and that could lead to successful chief executives being the ones who bankrupted their CCGs, or indeed left fatally wounded providers around them, but that was all right because you did very well either through finances or through CQC. We are on that much more complex journey. I'm not saying that the first one was easy, which is about still being well run. And I think Francis said it, nothing here will work if leadership lose oversight of their own organizations and they become badly run. So I'm afraid that has to kind of be built in as essential in any form of the world. But then really juggling a multiple series of relationships. There will be some at ICS. They clearly are whether that's within the acute collaborative, whether it's in the relationships they have to other ICS leaders, and that will vary enormously from each patch. I mean, we speak of provider collaboratives in ICSs. There are ICSs that only have one provider in them. So there's a huge variation there about what that ask would be. But then not to lose some of the really complicated issues that you're going to pick up at place, because once you start moving into the voluntary sector, and it's easy to say the voluntary sector, there are thousands of voluntary sector organisations. It is not possible for Sam or Steve to know them all. How that relationship works, many will be dealing with multiple local authorities. Local authorities, interestingly enough, also have their own divisions as to which part of the local authority you're dealing with. Is it the DASs, the social care side? Is it the education side? And so there's a complexity there about maintaining those relationships at those different levels. And that is a different ask. And it can be a tiring ask as well, particularly as in many parts of the country. Of course, NHS trusts are such big employers. They carry a lot of weight. They carry a lot of heft. And so there are a lot of people, not least in some parts of the voluntary sector, that are looking very closely at what their acute provider and its leadership does. Also for mental health and community too. That is an emergent relationship. I think as we go through it, there is a role for, once we would have thought of as commissioning, about making sure we've still got that helicopter view, that we haven't missed out the GPs, we haven't missed out carers. That's a tricky thing to juggle in your own mind as you're also running some very, very big institutions. So it's a real kind of reimagination of what leadership is for what are very, very big organizations.
Thanks, Richard. Steve, can I bring you in? I mean, you gave a very open answer to Chris's first question about some of the challenges that you have been dealing with. And, you know, yes, there were some successes through the first phase, but some reflections about what now is going to require more work and maybe harder work, you were saying, to rebuild some of what you're seeking to do in Harrogate. So it'd be great to understand from you the leadership task that you think you've got ahead of you and the lessons that you've learned thus far.
So it feels like quite a hard and daunting one, to be honest, because it doesn't feel like one job. It feels like many, which is a massive, obvious statement, really, isn't it? But when I started at Harrogate, one of the things I really wanted us to do, and still want us to do, is to become an organisation that thinks much more about health and well-being in its broadest terms for our population. And that was all about trying to build relationships in the place, because I think we perhaps have been quite focused internally. That felt almost manageable in some ways. Carry on running your organisation, but build better relationships in the place and try and join stuff up and do things together. The reality is, at the moment, there's a job to try and redo that, which is harder because of some of the issues that have happened through the pandemic. And I think it might have been Richard's point about some really important bits of the system feeling abandoned. We've definitely got that here. It's not just primary care, it's community services and children's services as well. We've also got to try and build a strong provider, collaborative, and play into an ICS. And for Harrogate, as you know, because you've helped us with this, we have to play into two. And to be honest, the challenge is the capacity for relationships. So the work is the work. There's a bit about redefining success for the health and care system to the earlier points, and being clear what the new deal is, and supporting people to transition to the new deal, as it were, and hardwiring that in. But having enough time and capacity to make and build meaningful relationships takes a huge amount of effort. So my sort of sub story in some ways is, in West Yorkshire, WIAT, the West Yorkshire Association of Acute Trusts, there's a network for every single profession, meets every month, does meaningful work together, and it means that when you get into a bit of a pickle and you need some help, you can pick up the phone and you get support, and you collaborate in a very, very different way. At the moment, we have to face into Humber Coast and Vale as well, and trying to do it all twice is just too much in some ways, and so you tend not to do any of it properly. So I think that's a very poor answer to your question, Hannah, but the leadership task is about continuing meaningful, constructive, collaborative relationships. That's the ask. It's just really hard to do. But in the end, the rest all follows from that. And yes, you need to hardwire some of that in structure terms. But, yeah, that's my pitch, I guess.
Francis and Sam are both nodding as you're speaking, Steve, because I think the challenge is the capacity for relationships, but you also in your answer talked about actually the benefit when you've got those and you can just pick up the phone. So I mean, Francis, it'd be great to hear your perspective on this challenge about building relationships and the lessons that you've learned.
Well, there's nothing like a crisis, is there, to bring people closer together? I mean, I arrived in NCL with hardly any relationships, and within 2 weeks I was manning the Gold Command and ringing up people I hadn't even met. And so I think there's definitely something about trust and understanding quickly that you need these people, you need to trust them, whereas sometimes you would take longer, that these people are established and have been here and are clearly doing great jobs, but it wouldn't be my normal way into how to build relationships. Things would be slower. I think the other thing is that if you want to make it even harder, build a relationship over Zoom. So you've got, you know, none of the sort of social cues about, oh, I think I'm doing this right. And you sort of, you know, sort of carry on regardless. So I think COVID has done fabulous things for relationships, because I think trust has been established in very, very difficult situations, which has to be sort of treasured, I think, because it's easy, as we know, it's hard to build trust and easy to break it. So maintaining those trusted relationships that have happened for me over the last 6 months is very, very important. I also think that there is something about inclusivity. So all of us, I'm sure, are working in very complex systems, and you can't have everyone in the room at the same time, just because you can't get the work done. So how do you, particularly as an ICS, remain inclusive and relevant? And I think in COVID we could do that, but now we're coming sort of into a different way of working. We're going into a second wave. It's really important that the ICS remains relevant. And I think it does that through the enabling leadership that we should be bringing. I think also our big challenges we've already alluded to is that there's a world out there that is not the NHS. And for many of us who've worked in the NHS for a very long time, how do we really understand what's going on in the local authority, the voluntary sector? It takes time. And it's Steve's point about how do you make the time to do that? So it's very much trying to fix short-term problems, but with a longer-term horizon in mind.
Yeah. Thanks, Francis. Sam, it'd be good just to get your take on this leadership ask that's being placed on your shoulders as well, and the capacity that you've put at building relationships.
So I would agree that with everything that Steve and Francis have said in terms of time and trust and partnership and collaboration has to be the way forward. I suppose the only thing I wanted to add into the conversation was I think there's a real window of opportunity now about how the regulatory structure responds, because if I think a bit about, I need the time and the headspace to advance those local conversations. If we get the regulatory response right, that could reinforce that direction of travel. But if it remains as it currently is in terms of how the regulatory framework works, that will actually push against that direction of travel. And it just feels like there is a window of opportunity in the first half of next year to make that change, and that might actually turbocharge this conversation and make it a success.
Thanks, Sam. I couldn't agree more. I guess I think sometimes the regulatory structure acts positively against your ability to build meaningful relationships. I know a lot of colleagues in local government will reflect the behaviour of the NHS in that regard. But Chris, why don't I hand back to you and maybe take us to a different topic?
What I'd like to do, Hannah, thank you, is sort of look to the future, because we've covered the sort of where we come from and where are we now, how does the environment and the landscape look. But if we put our crystal balls in front of us and look ahead for the next 2 or 3 years, I guess, the degree of optimism, pessimism, where colleagues on the panel are on that scale. And if you are feeling optimistic, yeah, is that simply your personality, or are there good grounds for feeling optimistic? Steve, you're smiling, so I'll come to you first.
I'll teach me. So I'm pessimistic and optimistic, which I know sounds it's a very poor way to answer your question, Chris. So I'm optimistic for maybe 18 months time, 12, 18 months time. I'm pessimistic for 3 to 6 months time. And I'm pessimistic for two reasons. One is the pandemic kind of ignited us all to try and think about a different way of working, a different set of things to focus on. And we had some really liberating discussions about inequalities and using resources differently. And rather than concentrating solely, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but solely on things like 52-week waits, we think about who is on our waiting list and who's not on a waiting list, but is hidden in their own homes. And that really energized the chief execs that I was privileged to be part of, chatting these things through. My pessimistic bit is the pull of the past in the NHS is really strong. So I don't wish to be critical of colleagues, because I understand the importance of it. The phase three response is really quite traditional, and it risks kind of almost pulling us back to where we were before and misses the opportunity of a slightly different future. And I suppose my other pessimism is doing all of the stuff we talked about takes time and effort. You made the point earlier, organisations still need to be well run. Whether it's a primary care practice, a community team, a social work team, or an acute trust service, colleagues are knackered. They've got no emotional reserve. Somebody said to me today, why are we talking about a national circuit breaker? What we need is a circuit breaker for staff. We haven't had one. We've come out of the first wave exhausted, having run on adrenaline, and we haven't had a circuit breaker before we go into the next one. And so my pessimism is not that we won't, in an optimistic way, try and keep our teams going, but the amount of effort that will take and the priority that we will all put on that will be so high that it will crowd out some of the time for the other stuff. Yeah. And I just wonder I worry that if we lose it, we might not get it back.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Richard.
So to follow the theme of pessimism and optimism, the pessimist in me just looks at the challenges of the recovery from the damage COVID-19 has already done and will continue to do. The wider context, the economy, I use an economist's phrase, is going down the toilet. And that is going to cause a lot of shock, both to partners the NHS works with, challenges to local communities, and probably to public finances. And we started COVID with a workforce crisis, and COVID hasn't helped, as Steve said, has made people more tired. Is there things there that make me more optimistic? I think there are. I think we've shown through COVID just how fast the NHS and the wider system can change. I think it was Sam that said it. I think it was kind of 3 or 4 years of digital change became kind of it wasn't 3 or 4 months, it was 3 or 4 weeks. And that is also true. I generally, if I speak to some people from the voluntary sector, they felt the relationship moved on in light years about how they could engage and the doors that were open to them, despite the enormous distraction to leadership that COVID was causing. So I think there's been the piece in there about confidence, about bringing a change through quickly, and some of the real benefits that broader collaboration and system working has delivered, I think, have been lived and felt by a lot of people. And where they didn't work, equally, you can see the gap. So some social care providers across the country, some parts of general practice, knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the system, and to be outside those doors. So I think there's optimism there that in some sense, the proof of principle we got through COVID. The challenge is, as we know, the fact there's going to be an awful lot to do. There may not be that much money. And there is the influence of history, not only on NHS cultures, but let's face it, on the cultures both of the voluntary sector but also within local government too. And so it's not all on the back of the NHS, but I think that proof of principle will carry us a long way.
Thanks. And Francis, if there's not much money around, we're going to have to start thinking, aren't we? You know, thinking differently about what we can do with the money we do have.
And I think there is cause for optimism there, because I think, as I said earlier, that there has been a huge shift in understanding about what happens outside of hospital. And I include myself in that, having worked in hospitals for most of my career. So I think that the recognition of the role that primary care community, the voluntary sector has played, has for the first time really been played out quite publicly. And I think we should be optimistic about that, because I think there is an understanding, a much better understanding, that actually we could spend our money differently. People are less attached to their institutions, and institutional loyalty is a good thing, and it's good that people have a place to identify with. But I think that we are going to move into a phase where we have the opportunity to be much more resident focused, and the voice of residents, and I think of people who represent residents, I think they are being heard, and I think we should be positive and optimistic about that.
Yeah, you remind me, just making those comments, one of our colleagues, Hannah and I at CF, is Donna Hall, who was Chief Exec of Wigan Council, is now Chair of Bolton Foundation Trust. And you know, the Wigan story is partly in a decade of austerity, having to make real cash cuts of over £100 million, but they've got the data on this demonstrating improvements in outcomes, improvements in happiness even. They measure happiness across Greater Manchester. I don't know what the score is at the moment, given what's going on up there, but yeah, it can be done, can't it? Where there's a will, there's a way, but we've got to think differently and behave very differently. So Sam, are we going to see that in the east of England?
So I mean, one of the things I'm optimistic about is that shift in the partnership conversation. And I think that's a real positive and something we can hold on to. And I also think the positive shift to talking about inequalities and outcomes, I'm really, really hoping is here to stay. We've been around this loop before, but we really need to hold on to it this time. I think, as Steve said, the thing I'm more worried about is the next 6 to 12 months. And I think I'm much more worried about the workforce than the beds. All the conversation is about the beds, but I think the thing that's going to unravel potentially first this winter will be the workforce, for all the reasons we've discussed. And then the other thing I'm just worried about is the care backlog. So I've gone from 6 52-week waiters in March to 4,000, and the number's getting bigger and bigger every week. So how we respond to that as an NHS is going to be absolutely enormous next year.
Yeah. So Hannah, if I pass back to you, I think we're almost out of time, but we reflected on one of the previous roundtables. In a sense, I think it was with Martin Marshall. This is the best of times and it's the worst of times. And, you know, there's no contradiction in holding those simultaneous thoughts in your mind at the same time. Hannah.
Thank you. And that's absolutely what I think everybody just did, Chris. So as you say, we don't have very much longer, but I do just want to quickly turn to Francis, particularly with what you said there about working with and building from residents. Can you see the question in the chat about data? Yeah, so this came up quite a lot in the conversation last week that Chris and I ran about place, and it's just helpful, I think, to get your perspective. It's a running theme on the importance of integration of data to really make a success of some of the things that you guys have been talking about.
So I think the important thing here is, whilst we talk about commissioning for population health, and we talk at, for us, NCL level, you can only make those judgments based on what you do know at neighbourhood level, and every neighbourhood is going to need something different, be it the number of GPs, the number of mental health workers, etc. And I think, and in some ways I draw on the work that actually we were doing in Hackney before I came to NCL about building the neighbourhood position. What is the neighbourhood workforce? What are the neighbourhoods doing? And some of that will be about things that we traditionally don't see as the NHS. So for example, is there somebody to advise on welfare benefits in the practice? It's those kind of things that will be built up from the bottom to really bring about that sort of population health change. And what we need to be able to do is to supply the right data at the right time to the right people to allow them to use it. And we know that there are various sort of bigger ticket items, particularly when we look at some of the early years stuff. But again, one size will not fit all, and we have to be willing to go down almost as far as we can and then build back up. So we also have to take a few risks, I think, in terms of if we argue about, well, who's going to pay for the welfare benefits advisor in that neighbourhood, then we'll never do it. So somebody's got to take some risks, and we're lucky we have UCL partners with us. We've got to do much more evaluation about the changes that we're making.
Thank you. I haven't got time to bring everyone in on this, but Richard, I know you've worked with all the ICSs nationally. Just give us a perspective on the integration of data point that the colleague is asking from the audience.
So I think it's true to say the NHS is awash with data. Does that always generate the insight and action that leads to change? I think that's part of the problem. And I reflect the fact I had a career as an analyst in the NHS, so I know what I'm talking about. Lots and lots of data packs that people used as slightly as comfort blankets, that they did know what was going on but didn't lead to action. I think there is something here about making sure the information flows are usable, as close to real time as you can. I know that isn't possible, but as close as you can. And it's really targeting the questions people want to answer. One of the things we have seen both at ICS, but very much at Place, the inequalities agenda does bring people back to the table. There's real concern about it, turning some of that data into actionable insights so that people can take action. I think that will drive investment in the data infrastructure and in the ability to interrogate that data and understand what it's trying to tell you.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful way, and I'm going to end us there. So Francis, Steve, Richard, Sam, I can't thank you enough for your time. I think that you have covered so many bases on what it takes to build resilient systems. And for sure, you've shown us the resilience of your own leadership through this discussion, and I guess the difficult times that we've got ahead, but also the opportunities that are there for the health and care system. You've also touched on some of the issues in our two other roundtables, workforce and place. So that's just a blatant plug for me that if you haven't watched those discussions, they're well worth it, because there's a huge synergy in what we've just talked about and those. And on that note, on the hour, I've got to say thank you very much. It was fabulous to have you all.